of the housekeeping rules for the morning presentation. Just to let you know again, all sessions will be recorded. If you're joining us online, please mute yourself while you are not speaking. And again, we do our best to provide as much interaction as possible. Presenters, a reminder, we will show you also the time when it is to conclude. And then also for online participants, please post your question or comment in the chat. Your question will be directed to the facilitator, who will raise it to the presenters. And for the participants present in DC, please raise your hand and the facilitator will call upon you. Without further ado, Audrey.
Great, thank you. I'm Audrey Sachs. I'm a Senior Social Development Specialist with the World Bank. And welcome to the panel, Yes, You Can Measure Social Cohesion, Strategies for Monitoring, Evaluation, and Learning. I'll be introducing the panelists. First, we're going to start with Alfredo Manfredini Bohm from the World Bank, and he'll be presenting with Taies Nezam, also from the World Bank. Then we'll have Kristen McCollum from the World Food Program, Emmanuel Ogbudu from Mercy Corps, Nell, Bolton from Catholic Relief Services, and Paola, Ballon from the World Bank. For those who are presenting online, please turn on your video during your presentation and during Q&A. And I would also like to emphasize the 5-minute limit to presentations, and we'll be cutting you off at exactly 5 minutes. Thank you. And over to Alfredo.
Thank you, Audrey, and let me not waste any of those minutes with niceties. So I would like to present just the beginning and the framing of the presentation, and then hand over to Taies around slide 3. So if we can move on to the next slide. So today we're here to talk to you about an attempt that we made to field the social cohesion measurement toolkit that Mercy Corps and World Bank developed together. We're in particular, we tried to field this in the context of Ethiopia's urban safety net that is now expanded to include refugees and their host communities in a under US $500 million IDA 19 grant that includes a 50 million contribution from the window for host and refugees. So essentially, the program is a poverty graduation program. So I'm from SPJ. I should have said social protection and jobs. So this is our bread and butter, and it is the operation extends to refugees and host communities what is already a tried and tested model in the urban safety net for Ethiopia, which consists of essentially 2 activities. 2 main work streams in line with BRAC's graduation approach. One is income support, which in our program takes the form of public works. The other is livelihood development, which involves trainings and grants. And this is over the course of 3 years, selected households receive the opportunity to work in public works, receive cash in exchange for their time, and training and grants in order to achieve a higher level of income generation and to start new income generation activities. What the WHR, the refugee and host window does in addition is to also include specific social cohesion activities that are meant to build social cohesion between host and refugee communities and within those communities. So both a poverty reduction program and a social cohesion building program. And this is the novelty with respect to the urban safety net project, sort of writ large, that encompasses a much broader scope of the poor in urban Ethiopia. The other twist that we have is that to build social cohesion activities, we have a bit of a hard component as well as the soft, which is bringing host and refugees together in the context of collaborative contact. So we have public works and livelihood trainings that are done either in separate groups or in mixed groups. And you'll see that the results we present today are laying the foundations for us to see what the effect of that mixing is. Next slide, please. So what we're trying to measure with our evaluation of this program is essentially the integrity of the process and the socioeconomic impacts of what we call RISEN, refugee and host integration through the safety net, which is this subcomponent of the urban safety net. With a pre-post type evaluation, we don't have a control group for this. The other thing that we are actually measuring with a more randomized approach is the impact of mixing groups into separate and mixed, of sorting refugees and host beneficiary households into mixed versus homogeneous groups, and what that does to socioeconomic impacts of the program and social cohesion. The baseline happened May this year, and the end line is expected for February 2023, inshallah. The theory of change we can probably skip over quickly. It's just about bringing for the whole presentation. Okay, we will skip. I'll hand over to Taies. Taies, over to you.
Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are. Next slide, please. Oh, sorry, can you go back one? Sorry about that. Okay, so I think have only 1 minute, so I'll be super quick and just very quickly just present some of the preliminary results that we got from our baseline. We basically used some of the dimensions from the toolkit, as Alfredo already mentioned, and we actually pulled out a few questions on, for example, on trust, and also on resources, where we used exactly the questions that you had in the toolkit. But for some of the other questions, we developed our own that were more specific to the context of the project and also Ethiopia. And some of the interesting findings that we've had so far is that that both groups, refugees and hosts, tend to have a very positive out-group attitude towards their out-group. That was very encouraging. But that while both groups also feel that they're able to lean on refugees, they feel that they can lean less on hosts, which was an interesting finding, given that the refugees have less resources to draw on than the hosts. And then with trust, which was one of the key areas that have been brought up many times today, we found that that while both groups feel that refugees would return a lost item, that classic question about the lost item, and hosts feel that hosts would return the lost items, refugees were less sure about hosts. And next slide, please. And as you can see with this slide, we've got some of the nuances between the different groups. While refugees trust other refugees, especially refugee women, and hosts trust other hosts, and they tend to trust refugees, refugees don't tend to trust hosts very much. And this is, again, very clear among women. There does seem to be a gender element. Women seem to be less trusting, and refugees tend to be less trusting. I'll stop there, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Thanks.
Great, and now on to Kristen from the World Food Program. Kristen?
Yes, thank you. So in the World Food Program, we have a relatively new impact evaluation unit. It started in 2019. Oh, should I pause until we have the slides?
Yeah, Anastasia, we don't have the right slides up yet. And Kristen, don't worry, we are not counting this against your time.
No, no worries. Here we go. Are we ready?
Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah, you're ready. Go ahead.
Good. Okay. So as I said, we started in 2019. We have a relatively, our team has been growing. We're 9 people now. And we cover a range of topics, but we do have quite a bit of donor push and also demand from the country offices to look at social cohesion as part of our humanitarian work stream. Go to the next slide and just kind of keep pressing space so it goes through the illustrations if you don't mind. In WFP, we have an approach to impact evaluation, which is similar to A/B testing in our humanitarian work stream. So we randomize beneficiaries into 2 groups and test out 2 alternative approaches to food assistance. When we're looking at the impact on social cohesion, there are several challenges that we keep in mind. Our approach to impact evaluation requires a large sample size. Almost by definition, they take place in contexts with fragile or conflict settings. And we need to measure quickly because any sort of hold up to the assistance could, of course, prevent us from really saving lives in some cases. And then combined with that, social cohesion as a concept, of course, is very multidimensional. It's context specific and it's relational, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But these are also additional challenges that we keep in mind when we think about how to measure social cohesion. Next. Next slide, please. Yeah, perfect. So there are really 3 key decision points that you can think about when thinking of how to measure. First, your source of data could be either secondary or primary. So here's a review of the UNHCR, World Bank, FCDO papers that were dropped that were published and commissioned this year. You'll see the vast majority, well, I wouldn't say the vast majority, but over half of them were using secondary data. It's a good use of resources. The data already exists. Often it comes from places like ACLED, Gallup World Poll, or any sort of national statistics office. And it's a good way to be able to have these kind of large sample sizes. In cases of ACLED, often the data is updated quickly. But of course, it kind of influences what sort of dimensions you'll be able to look at when you're talking about social cohesion in your study. Whereas if you're thinking about primary data, then you can have more of a breadth of understanding of social cohesion and perhaps kind of expand the dimensions that you're looking at. Here's a systematic review of 24 studies that was conducted by 3IE. They categorized it into dimensions such as willingness to help, trust, sense of belonging. This actually tracks very well with the last presentation, I noticed. And these, of course, as much as possible, should be linked to whatever theory of change we have in the program that we're evaluating. Then once that decision is made, if you're collecting primary data, it's really a matter of figuring out what the indicators are. So on the next slide, we'll see an example from Elsa Valley and her colleagues measuring social cohesion. This is a very direct approach where you're directly eliciting responses from people who are responding to the survey. Oftentimes they take the form of kind of Likert scale. So you give them a statement such as with a dimension of trust, I can rely on my neighbor to take care of my house if I'm away. And they essentially tell you how much they agree or disagree with that. There are some cases where it's merely binary, some cases where it's just kind of an integer value. But the point here is that if you know what dimensions you're measuring, then you want to populate it with primary data indicators. They don't have to be difficult. And research to date has actually taken kind of a relatively easy path on some of these issues. However, I do think that it's worth considering more innovative approaches. As I mentioned earlier, there's a very context-specific nature of social cohesion. It's very relational in a way that isn't the case with a lot of the outcome indicators that we look at in WFP. So in addition to these kind of direct questionings that we see across most of the papers, most of the large-scale quantitative papers, we also have seen a few trends in survey experiments, so going back all the way to 2013, but also a couple of papers from the UNHCR publications I mentioned earlier, tried some lab and field experiments and survey experiments. And then we at WFP are very much promoting a network approach as well. This is also promoted a little bit by BMZ, and you can see on the left a few examples of similar work that's been done before, and a lab at the University of Barcelona that's exploring network analysis as a way to measure social cohesion. So there's scope for more innovative approaches to really flesh out what we understand about social cohesion in these studies. So the big takeaways for us: secondary data exists, but it will likely bias what kind of measurements you're looking at. When you're collecting primary data, the first and probably hardest step is understanding which dimensions are relevant for you. But then these can be very simple, direct questions. However, I think there's still room for tackling some of these more, innovative approaches towards measuring social cohesion and getting a better idea of its relational and context-specific nature. Thank you.
Great, and thank you for keeping the time. I'll go to Emmanuel from Mercy Corps next. Over to you, Emmanuel.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me wait for the slide to come up. Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to focus my remark on how mixed method measurement approaches can help generate more specific insights into social cohesion dynamics. My remarks are based on the case study of some of the monitoring, evaluation, and research work I've led with the community initiatives to promote peace CIPP program in Nigeria. Is a USAID funded program to reduce violent conflict in 6 states in northern Nigeria. The program addresses the drivers of root causes of conflict and insecurity through an integrated approach that includes training leaders to improve their mediation skills and conducting inter-ethnic and inter-religious dialogue designed to strengthen social cohesion, among other activities. We conducted a mixed method research study on the relationship between religion and conflict in northern Nigeria. This study will be my focus, the focus of my remarks today. Next slide, please. Okay, the research study on religion and conflict was motivated by an open question that we were grappling with during the early phases of our programming in 2019 and 2020. What are the specific processes by which religious actors, beliefs, identities, and institutions catalyze violent conflict? Answering these questions about the nature of the interreligious conflict is important for our program because getting the diagnosis right has a big implication for what activities we choose and how we implement them. Next slide, please. So to answer this research question, we drew on multiple quantitative and qualitative data sources, including violent events data over 10 years. We complemented this analysis of violent event data with 2 phases of field research in Kaduna and Kano State in Nigeria. The first phase used 165 in-depth interview, and the second 750 resident survey to capture insight into social cohesion and conflict dynamics. This included questions on social cohesion from Mexico and World Bank Social Cohesion Toolkit, as well as questions on religious freedom, insecurity, and support for violence. Next slide, please. So the survey also included a randomized survey experiment that was designed to assess the relationship between religious identity and support for violence. In this experiment, respondents were randomly assigned to read one of 2 nearly identical versions of a scenario featuring an interpersonal dispute with a shopkeeper, and then they were asked about their level of support for different kinds of non-violent or violent retaliation. Half of the respondents, they were randomly assigned to receive a generic version of the scenario, that is a control version, and the other half received a treatment version, which was identical to the control scenario, except the shopkeeper was identified as a member of the respondents' religious outgroup. You can see that on the slide here. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, for the sake of this panel, I'm going to highlight just 2 key findings from this large study that illustrate how our use of mixed method helps us better understand the dynamics related to social cohesion and conflict. First, our analysis of the violent data highlighted that only a small percentage of violence has been interreligious in nature. The analysis from the ACLAID, which is what is featured on this slide, and other 2 event data set indicates that from 2011 to 2020, only 9% of attacks clearly targeted or were carried out by religious group, and only 10% of fatalities were ascribed to conflicts over a religious issue. Next slide, please. Okay, second, we find that rather than being driven by religious belief or hatred, violence that falls along religious line is typically a consequence of insecurity and a lack of social cohesion between ethno-religious groups. So we found, what we found is that respondents are no more likely to support a violent punishment for the shopkeeper in the case when he's clearly identified as a member of their religious outgroup than when his group identity is not mentioned at all. The finding is consistent across Muslim and Christian respondents and tells us that identity alone is insufficient to explain how conflict escalates into violence. Next slide. Okay, so this slide shows how the interaction between security and weakening social cohesion combine to lead to violence. In particular, a decrease in the index measure of social cohesion is associated with the increase in respondents' willingness to endorse violence from 43% to 60%. This shows that heightened insecurity and the lack of intergroup trust seed fear and uncertainty. Both of these patterns leads to dynamics in which local political competition or interpersonal dispute escalate into cycles of violence through the mobilization of religious identities by both elites and ordinary citizens. Lastly, the last slide, please. So for us, the big picture takeaway for this research is that recent intercommunal violence in northern Nigeria is simply not a consequence of religious discrimination or hatred. Rather, our analysis indicates that the violence that we are observing is as a result of intersection of factors, including governance gap, particularly in security provision, and a lack of social cohesion between groups. The evidence-driven shift in mindset and framing led us to recommend and adopt a set of specific programming intervention to address the religious aspect of intercommunal conflict in northern Nigeria. This includes intervention that focus on preventing escalation of disputes into violence by training religious leaders in negotiation and dispute resolution, and paying specific attentions to misinformation and disinformation within windows of risks, such as the elections that are coming up in the early 2023. Thank you very much, and over.
Great, thank you, Emmanuel. Over to Nell from Catholic Relief Services.
Thank you, Audrey. Is this working? Okay, good. I'll just wait a moment until the slides come up, if that's okay. Great, thanks. So while that's getting put on the screen, my name is Nell Bolton with Catholic Relief Services, and I want to share just a couple of resources we're using to measure social cohesion, as well as to examine its multiplier effects on other development and humanitarian outcomes. Next slide, please. So for us at CRS, we believe that thriving societies begin with social cohesion and justice. And for development to happen, people across groups, across hierarchies, need to be able to listen to each other, trust one another, and together come together and work on their collective priorities. And when people address what's dividing them, build on what unites them, they experience the kind of transformational change that makes development possible. Next slide, please. Briefly at CRS, Briefly at CRS, we conceptualize social cohesion as playing out in three spheres of society: the sociocultural, the economic, and the political, and as having both horizontal and vertical dimensions. Next slide, please. So the first resource to mention is a social cohesion indicators bank, which CRS developed in 2018-2019 in order to supply illustrative outcome level indicators for social cohesion programs. Next slide, please. The Social Cohesion Indicators Bank is organized according to the same three spheres that I just mentioned. And in order to balance technical rigor and conceptual clarity with local adaptability, the bank breaks down those spheres into their constituent domains and then drills down to illustrative results that a program might seek in each of those domains. So just to give one example, within the economic sphere, there's a domain connected to resource allocation and management. Within that, two of the illustrative results are connected to inclusive management of natural resources and equitable management of public finances. Next slide, please. Each of those results has both a subjective and an objective indicator that is provided on an illustrative basis along with reference sheets to support further customization to a given context. Next slide, please. The second resource that I wish to mention is a social cohesion barometer, which CRS originally developed as a facilitation tool for use in social cohesion workshops to guide participants to assess and share their perceptions of the level of social cohesion in a given context or defined geographic area, and then to reflect on those results to support visioning and action planning. Next slide, please. What we found is that there began to be, let me just briefly introduce the barometer. Next slide, please. And then Anastasia, if you can just click through the animation, that would be great. The barometer is also organized according to those same 3 spheres with 6 items per sphere for a total of 18 that are assessed on a 5-point Likert scale. So for example, in the political sphere, people in my community are treated fairly by public officials. In the sociocultural sphere, there's an item looking at diversity of relationships. Next slide, please. What we found is that there began to be organic uses of this workshop tool for measurement purposes, everything from pre-design assessments to context monitoring to support adaptive management, to its use as a quantitative measure of social cohesion in baseline inline studies to search for significant changes in the level of social cohesion. And so what we have been doing over the past 6 months, we've been working with the Institute for Economics and Peace to run various statistical analyses to validate this tool, develop index scoring and guidance, as well as guidance on its use for monitoring and evaluation purposes, so that there'll be greater standardization and comparability of the results and the findings from different contexts. Next slide, please. The third and final point that I wish to make is that we are not only interested in measuring social cohesion for its own sake, but also looking at the effect of stronger social cohesion on other development outcomes, be they connected to economics or to health. Next slide, please. We're pursuing this question and these questions through a variety of measures, everything from observation to case study documentation, to ex post studies, to quasi-experimental and experimental research studies. For the sake of time, we have 3 studies underway right now, experimental studies that we'll see results on in 2023. But for sake of time, I'll just flip to the final slide, if you can go ahead, please, to share some of the results that are quite interesting from a recent short-term study in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And here, savings and lending groups that benefited from social cohesion strengthening and conflict management skills strengthening saw actually stronger economic outcomes even than the groups that did not receive the social cohesion intervention. So it's kind of well known that savings and lending groups create bonding social cohesion within group members. We saw comparable sociocultural outcomes, but when we looked at the economic results, we saw the kind of things that you see on the screen here. Increase in joint economic activities, income generating activities, productive use of loans, and a reported satisfaction with one's own sense of financial and economic well-being. So these are the kind of very promising results that we are continuing to build on and look forward to sharing further evidence as it is generated. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you so much, Nell. And over to Paola for the last presentation in this panel. Paola, over to you.
Thank you, Audrey. Good afternoon, good morning, everyone. I'm Paola Ballon, Senior Economist in Data and Analytics of Social Sustainability and Inclusion Global Practice. So while I wait my slides, just wanted to emphasize that the presentation for today would basically focus on how we can contribute from our experience into project design, specifically on how the role of normative choices can influence indicator design. Next slide, please. So the presentation will basically talk about this important aspect, how normative choices are essentially embedded in the choices of the indicators and the questions themselves when we are interested in, let's say, designing an indicator for monitoring and evaluation. We also refer to the desiderata, let's say, list of properties that these indicators may wish to have, and we'll illustrate two examples. One, what we call macro, which is the building of the global database from our practice, and a second one, which uses essentially applications for two particular countries for multidimensional exclusion. Next slide, please. So our choices underline measurement design really normative, specifically when we talk about indicators, specifically when we have data that's constrained and one variable that is just available for measuring. What can we say about that? Is it really normative? Or if the indicator, the variable, is considered to be redundant by some statistical criteria, will we deselect it simply because it's not normative? Or what experts may say about it? So these questions were asked by ourselves when we were building this global database. Next slide, please. And we came up with an interesting review of literature that tells us that normative choices operate at various levels. And when choosing indicators, we are very much interested in having a combination of expert assessments, the indicator accuracy, empirical assessments such as the data quality or measurement error when we choose one particular variable or indicator, theoretical assessments that talk about the standards or conventions on particular indicators, practicalities in the sense of political will or other constraints that we may face specifically in a project, and its policy relevance. Next slide, please. So this leads us to a plural desiderata, something that I have explored with other colleagues in the past, but also that tells us some information of what the properties of these indicators may be. Specifically, we would like indicators that are understandable and easy to describe, that reflect common sense notions of social cohesion, for instance, that fit the purpose of what we are trying to develop, which are technically solid, which are operationally viable, and most importantly, easily replicable. Next slide, please. For the Social Sustainability Global Database and Dashboard, we essentially put together all possible data sources. Our aim was basically to try to have indicators that could be used for country profiling, for benchmarking, but also to look at associations with other important development variables, such as poverty, inequality, or growth. But in addition to that, part of our mandate is to look at these, let's say, disaggregations by vulnerable populations. We were very much interested in having sources that could be merged and that could provide us information by age groups, by gender, indigenous populations, or by area. Next slide, please. In the case of social cohesion, what we have done is essentially look at variables that talk about social cohesion as itself defined, but also in terms of social capital. We looked at Afrobarometers, Latino barometers, all barometers were value surveys, and here you have a count of the number of countries we were able to retrieve from all these sources. Keeping in mind this data in each of these steps when selecting the indicators. Next slide, please. We have also tried to do a little bit further than that, to go beyond this cross-country comparability for benchmarking, for instance, of a country profile, and try to assess multidimensional exclusion from an approach which essentially looks at the exclusions that a person experiences in 3 dimensions. Inclusion in terms of economic inclusion, resilience and social cohesion, and empowerment, voice, and accountability. These dimensions are essentially built on what our director this morning was talking about on social sustainability. Even here, our example for Peru and South Africa here shows that we have extracted information from surveys, household surveys, and we try to harmonize them so that they can be comparable. But even there, despite of trying to harmonize, there will be always differences. For instance, in this particular indicator, where one talks about confidence and the other talks about distrust. Next slide, please. To conclude, what we found in this interesting study is that we can have an assessment of exclusion, we can have an assessment of social cohesion from a multidimensional perspective, and have a profiling of what are the drivers of this exclusion. So to conclude, I would say that we are in a good position in terms of exploiting the available data sets and available external sources that other colleagues have mentioned when measuring social cohesion, and specifically when designing in a project. We would like to keep in mind a desiderate of properties that these indicators may have. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Paola. And now I'd like to open it up for questions. and discussion. If it's okay, I would like to kick it off with a question about indicators and experiences with indicators. I would like to hear about from teams who have included an indicator of social cohesion that didn't work and didn't yield variation. I know I've had in my own work indicators that came back with over 95% agreement, which clearly doesn't reflect the situation on the ground, or indicators that came back with just too much variation that doesn't make sense. So that's my question. Over.
Thank you. Do I need to introduce myself one more time? Okay, so for panelists, maybe they were not here. Professor Karina Karaslina, Professor, Carter School for Peace and Conflict Resolution. In the first panel, a lot of people were speaking about common shared identity as an indicator of the conceptual idea. But then we speak about measurement. I didn't see any measurement of such ways like cross-categorization, recategorization, common identity models, shared society. So any way how we can measure it, any ideas about it. And very similar to your second question, which you asked, we just conducted survey in Ukraine, and we found exactly, if you ask direct question, people overwhelmingly will answer yes or no, and like, do you want to fight for Ukraine? Yes. Do we need to save lives? Yes. So what we really found in such situation of protracted violence, and you really need to give dilemmas for people to choose, then you will really give a pretty good distribution of results. So this is two questions. Thank you.
Great. So I'll turn to Emmanuel for the question on identity, if that's okay. Emmanuel, can you turn on your video and try to answer that question? And I'll also turn to Alfredo to answer it. Emmanuel. Great.
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay, so I don't know if you want to repeat the question again. Please, can you summarize it for me?
Sure. How did you measure social cohesion indicators related to identity? Identity-based social cohesion indicators.
Okay, so on this particular research, we did not measure that in particular, but we are looking at violence, conflicts in northern Nigeria. I want to see exactly if the identity of someone, maybe he says he belongs to a particular culture or he belongs to a particular religion, actually affects it. So what we looked at from that experiment that I talked about is trying to see if is a social experiment where we try to see if the people, if someone that is a Christian or someone that is a Muslim, we want to take side with the person that is from the same religious with the other person. Well, we discovered that there is no correlation. These people are not going to say that because this person is my religion, that is why I'm going to support him in doing something. So we discovered that the relationship is not there at all, because these things are just things that people come up with, saying that these are the root causes of conflict, while actually they are not the root causes of conflict. I don't know if I'm able to answer the question.
If I may, because my question was very different, not how identity impact, but how you measure common identity, shared identity, cross-cutting identities, all these conceptual ideas as a part of the concept of cohesion, but I didn't hear how you measure.
Yeah.
Okay, okay, go ahead.
No. All right. In terms of measurement of identity, actually, this answers a little bit both of the questions posed, because we actually decided to not focus that much on identity in the survey that we fielded, for the simple reason that in the communities that we surveyed, the shared identity was very strong. We are talking about the Somali region in Ethiopia, where both refugees and host actually are of Somali origin, and so actually come from the basically the same cultural, ethnic, and religious matrix as one another. In that context, given that it was also an operational context, we didn't necessarily want to emphasize the refugee host distinction, which is sort of more clear to us, often donors and programmers, than it is to people living in the communities there. So in a way, that was also the indicator that we found potentially less useful, but because of the context. And so that also answers the question around measurement. Thank you.
Okay, great. I'll open it up to more questions. Ryan, I saw your hand up earlier. Over.
Yeah, I just have a question for everyone. Is I heard a lot of presenters mention that these measurements were being deployed in the context of whether it's A/B testing or rapid evaluations, manuals. The research he described was in the context of a complex program. So I'd love to hear kind of how the operational or practical constraints hit with the reality of trying to do these various rigorous forms of measurement. Over.
Great. If it's okay, I would like to start with Kristen from WFP to answer this, since Kristen talked about very resource-intensive measures of social cohesion. Over.
Sure. So we have quite a few examples of where we've done similar indicators that I showed in my slides in contexts that are tricky to access and where we need kind of quick surveys. I will say that we've learned a few things just about the logistics, which is that enumerators need, because this is not a topic that is routine like it would be in income or food security. We found that enumerators need extra time to really come to grips with what these questions are asking. And so that's kind of one kink that we've had to iron out along the way. But other than that, the direct questions are actually they don't cause that many bumps, though I will concede one of the kind of comments about needing to see more variation and a comment actually in the chat about really not understanding kind of what those measure. With the social network data collection, luckily, we're very lucky in the past probably 3 years, there have been really huge strides in technology that's allowed us to capture this in ways that you just wouldn't be able to capture before. And so we're relying a lot more on kind of new applications that make it very participatory for people to explain what their kind of social worlds and interactions look like. So I can give references to that in the chat too.
Kristen, if I may, are you collecting dyadic-based relational data, or are you using a different method? Over.
Yeah, good question. So it's egocentric. So a person will report on the interactions that they've had in a specific period of time, and then they will tell us how those people are related to each other. And then they will kind of qualify those relationships depending on the dimensions that we're interested in. So oftentimes this would be something like trust or altruism, so how likely it is that they would be able to give or receive support from these people. So it's not a full kind of social network that is bounded geographically, which is particularly important in the context of displacement, where people's networks are quite dispersed, right? It allows them to kind of name the connections that are actually important to them in their kind of lived social world. I hope that answers the question.
Indeed, thank you. Nell, would you also like to comment on the question on resources?
Sure. I mean, I would say that what we found, I'm thinking here of the use of the social cohesion barometer for MEL purposes, measurement purposes, and we found that the pre-testing is really essential. That is something that needs to be done because of the ways in which some of these higher level concepts, even with the 18-item barometer, some of those concepts, the way that they're expressed in local terms and local languages just does need to be checked to make sure that it's going to get the kind of results that you need. In addition, for enumerators to really think through carefully and be trained carefully on how the questions will be posed and even what the response options are within the Likert scale. We've certainly had instances in which, in a context where disagreement is socially unacceptable, framing the response options in terms of agree, disagree, leads you to those 95% agree, results that you were mentioning. But then sometimes even with higher scores, some of the richness is in the comparative analysis when you break down the demographics in terms of the contrast in perceptions of social cohesion in a given context. And so really making sure that there's care to what additional information is going to be needed to support the analysis and interpretation has also been key for us. Thanks.
Great, thank you. I'll now turn to Maureen to summarize some of the questions from the chat. Over.
Thanks, Audrey. So I just want to summarize some of the content coming in the chat. So first, we had one response to your question, Audrey, about a question that did not work out. So this wasn't so much about a lack of variation, but it's an example from Corey talking about a survey in the Kakuma camp in Kenya. And so there was a question about frequency of shared meal between host and refugee as a measure of trust. But it turns out that in practice, hosts will sell wood or charcoal to refugee who will pay them in food. And this was interpreted as sharing a meal, but this wasn't really the intended use of the question. So that goes to what you were saying, Nell, about pre-testing and having some interpretation. We have quite a few questions to Emmanuel about any difference you saw or measured between Muslim and Christian respondents' support of violence. So I know you answered in the chat, but great if you can answer for everybody in the room. And also about how you build this measure of support for violence and what predicted probability meant. And then I also see that Paola wants to come in, and I don't think you've had a chance to talk yet. So if it makes sense, maybe Emmanuel first, then Paola.
Okay, thank you very much. Like I responded on the chat box, I said that the respondents are no more likely to support a violent punishment for the shopkeeper in the case when he's likely, is clearly identified as a member of their religious outgroup than when his group identity is not mentioned at all. This findings is consistent across Muslim and Christian respondents and tells us that identity alone is insufficient to explain how conflict escalates into violence. So what we are trying to say here is that from the experiment, it shows that whether you belong to, whether you're a Christian or you're a Muslim, it doesn't affect the response of the participants to either meting a punishment to that particular person. So the religion aspect does not affect them at all, but we discover that other aspects are the things that influences people to react the way they do. For the second question that I talked about, we look at the graph was actually based on a regression analysis of the survey question about participation in violence. That graph showed the marginal effect of social cohesion and insecurity on the likelihood of responding yes to that question. He's not talking about the probability, is it the probability that he's asking about? He's talking about, we use the regression analysis for that particular graph. Thank you, and over.
Paola, please, over to you.
Thank you, Audrey. I just had a comment on our first question, which was about measuring identity and how we do that with social cohesion. I think this is basically something that takes us back to what I was mentioning at the beginning in my 5 minutes. Essentially, that identity is clearly intersectional. So who is the person who decides essentially which identities are the ones we are interested in looking at when we are trying to do appraisals in social cohesion? Is it one particular identity, or is it a combination of various identities? So this is the role of normative choices. And essentially, depending on the project, I mean, if it's a small project or is it a cross-country analysis, the decision would be different. But clearly, it will be based on a combination of expert consultations, on deliberative assessments, but also on theoretical grounds. So it requires a multi-criteria every time, whenever we are choosing one particular variable, one particular indicator, or one particular identity. So that's the only point I wanted to stress. Thank you.
Are there more questions coming from the chat?
We don't have a lot of additional questions specifically coming from the chat. A lot of questions about requesting or sharing resources, and we'll be talking about avenues for doing so shortly. Yes, no other questions for now from the chat that I have seen.
If I may, I also have 2 more questions. For those who have used survey experiments, like Kristen from WFP, I know Mercy Corps has used survey experiments, maybe you have too. How do you communicate the findings to policymakers? And do they understand the experiment? And then the second question, it's more of a request, I guess, for Ryan. Would it be possible to compile the various indicators teams are using into a spreadsheet and show the distributions by question? Over.
Yeah, I wasn't expecting a question. I mean, it's always possible to make a spreadsheet, and you ask the right person, but I think it's an interesting question to kind of broaden that out. Just even thinking about the World Bank and Mercy Corps toolkit, that we're using that in parallel across both of our organizations. And I do think just even for the 2 of our organizations starting to do that, mapping and lesson learning is a great idea. And then starting to bring this up. I mean, what I was scribbling down when Nell was speaking is wanting to start to do some of this cross-referencing with the Mercy Corps World Bank toolkit and the tools from CRS that Nell shared. So I think it is possible. I do not raise my hand to be the sole keeper or maker of that spreadsheet, but you know, this is a collective effort. So I think as we look ahead to next steps, especially in the final panel, there's something really cool there. And I'll pause there, but I can talk more about survey experiments as well, but I'll share the mic.
Okay, who would like to address survey experiments? So conjoint, list, and various other forms of experiments. Over.
I can jump in if no one else is eager.
Please.
So we did a conjoint experiment in South Sudan, which was meant to act as a way to weight a social cohesion index. So we essentially had presented kind of 2 different hypothetical communities where the different dimensions of social cohesion were randomly varied. And then from that, we would be able to elicit which dimensions are kind of most influential to whether or not they say that a community is more likely to be peaceful. We try to avoid, if I'm talking about communication, so we try to avoid too much of the mechanics of it. The point here is that the method allows us to elicit something that a person might not really know at the front of their head, right? So instead of direct questioning, we use randomization to kind of pull out some opinions that people wouldn't be necessarily know that they had. So that's the point. We don't really need to say much more than that. And then we emphasize the use. So in this case, it's really nice because the coefficients almost directly, I mean, you normalize them, but they almost directly end up being, you know, weights of an index, which I think most people can kind of come to terms with. But before we would do any sort of experiment, we would want to make sure, survey experiment, we would make sure that that kind of translation to, okay, how would I use this is clear before we take any steps. I think in that case, it ended up being very useful.
And did the findings resonate with the policymakers in the country? Over.
Yeah, so we presented it to kind of 2 groups. So one of them was the conflict advisor in the area. So for her, it's kind of a nice way to understand which types of interventions she should focus on in the area where we did the experiment. So that was easy. And then for the other group, it was our monitoring team. So WFP has kind of a research and monitoring division that does large scale, almost constant large scale surveys. So for them, it was a good way for them to understand kind of how they can be getting a more accurate depiction of what's happening on the ground. I'm not sure for the monitoring team that any action has been taken on that, but we're still trying to advocate for this in more countries as a proof of concept.
Great, thank you. Over.
Yeah, okay, thank you so much. For the case of the peace program that we implemented in Niger and Burkina, Niger, I have to say, the results have been widely shared with the authorities, the local authorities in charge of social cohesion at the country level, as well as at the army level, the one in charge of security at the national level. So we had a workshop where we presented all the results, and also with other partners, all the NGOs. So today in Niger, Mercy Corps, in terms of social cohesion, the government knows very well what we have been doing in terms of all these decision makers, and we receive, for your information, we receive a recognition letter about our work on that. Thank you.
Well, and on that, some of that work also had some very complex survey experiments, and part of the communication was Siaka just telling me every time that it needed to be more simple and more brief. And so that kind of partnership in developing the messages is actually really key, because what I thought was simple needed 5 more levels of simplification to communicate, but we worked that out together.
Great, thank you. Other questions, please?
Yeah, just maybe a general thought. As I think about measurement, I'm always thinking about, the way we're talking about social cohesion, is this a mean to an end or an end in itself? And I think Nell kind of went in that direction a little bit in terms of talking about what are the outcomes, because unless we understand these things, we're not going to be able to have social cohesion be context specific and then figure out what we're going to measure. And part of that is, what is the problem we're trying to solve for, which really doesn't come in social cohesion, it goes somewhere else. So I think that question needs to come up a little more often. The other thing is about measurement in general, and because I'm hearing about impact evaluations, and I'm hearing that a lot of what we're looking at tend to be more in conflict situations. And my thinking is not just about the depth of these impact evaluation, but the frequency. And I heard rapid evaluations, but also frequency becomes important, because social cohesion does change over time. We saw from the graphs that Emmanuel showed on Nigeria that there are changes over time. So I'm just wondering how much we're thinking about frequency in addition to other elements around that. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much for both of these points. I'll just jump in with a couple of initial responses. First, for us at CRS, we see social cohesion both as an end unto itself. We've been doing, peacebuilding cohesion programming for 25 plus years, and as a means to this broader, more sustainable, more locally owned, more permanent change in people's quality of life and their well-being. So we see it as both. That does bring in a challenge when it comes into the measurement. And this, I think, gets back to a resource constraint. Because we are looking at it from both aspects, our experimental studies that are underway right now that are really focusing on the question of what is the follow-on impact of stronger social cohesion on development outcomes in different sectors. That becomes challenging because for ethical reasons, we think it's really important that all of the communities participating in the program have the opportunity to benefit from the social cohesion intervention. That means our time period for seeing those differential results between the treatment and control communities is necessarily shorter than we might want it to be to really see the longer term impact. So it does, hook in, I think, with measurement challenges as well. And when it comes to the second part of your question, I'm suddenly blanking on what that was. Maybe you can refresh me. Frequency, right. So now with the sort of newly validated version of the social cohesion barometer and the ability to have more confidence in its use as a valid and reliable measurement tool, as well as its scoring, according to indices by sphere and by dimension, vertical or horizontal, we're actually exploring opportunities for it to be used in ways that tie in with some of the other more regular, more periodic monitoring that's done. For example, we've got a monthly interval resilience measurement tool, assessment tool. We're looking at what are our possibilities to bring in more frequent assessment of social cohesion dynamics, recognizing just how dynamic they are. Thank you.
Alfredo, can you also address the question on how much time is needed to see changes based on your impact evaluation?
Yeah. Yes. Thank you. And Taies, if you want to chip in as well, please please flag somehow in the in the system. No, I think the frequency and the timing issue is very much at the top of our heads right now. We're in implementation for the first phase of the project, and so we're seeing this program kick into gear now. And we're very well aware that as wrinkles in project implementations are ironed out, actually the perception of participants and beneficiaries will change over time. And so the time at which we take the temperature may very well determine the type of answers that we get. So while we don't have necessarily the structure to do high frequency follow-up right now, we want to see how our end line, which, as I've mentioned, is scheduled for February next year from a baseline in May, what we get from there and what the results are telling us and how noisy the output seems to be, to then see if we can do phone-based survey follow-ups and those kinds of things.
Great. Any final questions before we conclude the session? Okay, I would like to thank the panelists and to the participants for a very rich discussion, and thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Just before the lunch break, I'd like to share how we're going to distribute the event materials and the recordings here. There have been also many questions in the chat. We will have an event page, and we will share with you the link to this event page later after this conference, and there you should be able to access the recordings or any eventual event materials. We also share materials on the Social Cohesion Hub. The link should be posted in the chat right now, and there you should be also able to find the recordings and event materials. I don't want to hold you off from the well-deserved lunch break.